At 82, Angie Dickinson isn't interested in sugarcoating anything. She's lived long enough to outlast the gossip columns, studio system, and the old Hollywood rules that once kept young actresses silent. Her career started in a time when one wrong move could destroy everything, and when the most powerful men on set had a kind of influence no one dared challenge. One of those men was John Wayne. On screen, he was the unshakable hero, steady, confident, always in control. Off-screen, that same presence could feel just as overwhelming. When Dickinson talked about filming Rio Bravo, she hinted at moments of tension, a quiet kind of intimidation, and the pressure of trying to stand her ground next to a legend who was used to getting exactly what he wanted. It was a side of Wayne most people never dared to describe. Walking onto the Rio Bravo set in 1958 felt like stepping onto another planet for Dickinson. She was still in her late 20s, still earning her place in Hollywood. And suddenly she was face to face with a man who practically was American cinema. John Wayne wasn't just famous, he was iconic. His voice, slow and deliberate, could fill a room even when he barely spoke above a whisper. People stepped aside for him without thinking. Conversations went quiet the second he entered. It was like the whole set tilted in his direction. From their very first table read, Dickinson felt the weight of Wayne's reputation. He wasn't unkind. He didn't have to be, but everything he did felt intentional. Every pause, every glance, carried this subtle pressure, as if he were always evaluating the people around him. On camera, he played the strong protector. Off camera, that same strength could feel overwhelming to someone still fighting to prove she belonged. It wasn't just his size, though he towered over almost everyone. It was his certainty, this unshakable sense of belonging, as if he had never once questioned his place in the world. When he locked eyes with someone, it was almost impossible to look away, like he was silently insisting on your full attention and testing whether you could handle it. For Dickinson, who had already learned how to navigate complicated sets and unpredictable personalities, this was something different. The power dynamic was never spoken aloud, but it was always there. Wayne didn't need to bark orders or act demanding. His presence set the tone by itself. And yet, there was something magnetically compelling about him, his confidence. His calm authority, the way people gravitated toward him without him ever asking. She could feel the magnetism in John Wayne's charm. But underneath it was something harder and unshakable stubbornness. The kind that made it clear he wasn't the type to give an inch. She found herself wondering what would happen if someone pushed back against that force instead of going along with it. She didn't have to wonder for long. The first real test of working with Wayne arrived much sooner than she expected, and it would set the tone for everything that followed. Before Rio Bravo placed her beside one of Hollywood's biggest legends. Angie Dickinson had been steadily climbing her way through the industry's competitive maze. Born Angelin Brown in 1931, she grew up in North Dakota before her family eventually settled in California. She didn't have any insider connections, no relatives in the business, no special introductions. What she did have was a mix of ambition, intelligence, and a presence on camera that made people take notice in the early 1950s. She began appearing in TV dramas, westerns, and anthology shows, proving she could handle quick-paced dialogue just as well as action-heavy scenes. There was a certain toughness to her early career. Hollywood wasn't kind to young actresses, especially ones fighting not to get boxed into a single type of role. Dickinson learned early that charm might get her inside the door, but only talent kept her there. She took whatever roles she could, even small ones in films hardly anyone remembers now. But each part was a stepping stone that built her reputation. When director Howard Hawks noticed her, it wasn't because she was campaigning for attention, it was because she delivered consistently strong performances, no matter the size of the role. Hawks, known for spotting sharp, quick-witted actresses, saw in her the exact combination of intelligence and spark. Needed to stand toe-to-toe with a star like John Wayne, getting cast was a breakthrough. But it was also the beginning of an enormous challenge. A role opposite Wayne came with instant credibility. But it also meant stepping directly into a spotlight where he had reigned for decades. There would be no shallow end to ease into. Her character, Feathers, wasn't written as a simple love interest. She was quick, independent, and capable of meeting Wayne's sheriff line for line. That meant Dickinson had to match his presence not just in the script, but in the atmosphere he carried everywhere he went. Then there was Howard Hawks himself. He wasn't harsh or explosive, but he demanded precision. He could run take after take, not because the actors were doing anything wrong, but because he was searching for a rhythm for tiny, natural shifts that made a scene breathe. Dickinson knew she'd be stretched from both sides, Hawks's perfectionism and Wayne's powerful on-set aura, and the whispers didn't make it easier. Actors who had worked with Wayne before described him with careful phrases like strong, personality. A description so vague it could mean anything, from a friendly kind of stubbornness to something much more dominating. Some actors praised John Wayne's generosity, saying he liked to mentor younger performers. Others hinted he didn't have much patience for hesitation or mistakes. Dickinson, always straightforward herself, wondered which version she was about to encounter. The only thing she knew for sure was that Rio Bravo wasn't the kind of film you could just drift through. It would take stamina, sharp instincts, and a steady presence to survive it. That test began the moment she walked onto the unbaked set for her first real scene with Wayne. But before she even reached him, she had to convince Howard Hawks that she could portray Feathers with just the right blend of charm, defiance, and intelligence without letting Wayne's towering sheriff overshadow her every line. The first time Angie Dickinson stepped into a scene opposite John Wayne, she instantly understood why people called him the Duke. It wasn't just his height or the way he filled out his costume. It was his sheer gravitational pull. He could dominate a scene without uttering a single word. In their first exchange as Feathers and Sheriff John T. Chance, Dickinson was supposed to keep up with his quick comebacks, match his gaze, and hold her ground. On the page, the moment looked simple enough. In front of the camera, it felt like standing in front of a shifting wall of energy. Wayne had this uncanny ability to set the rhythm of a scene just by existing in it. If he slowed his speech, everyone's cadence adjusted automatically. If he paused before a line, time itself seemed to stretch. If he shifted his stance, the whole set subtly moved with him. Dickinson noticed this almost immediately, and it rattled her. She was performing, yes, but she was also responding to something instinctive, something powerful that Wayne carried without effort. Hawks had warned her, in his quiet, cryptic way, that Wayne worked best with co-stars who could push back, who didn't shrink in his shadow. That was what made the dialogue spark. But actually pushing back against a presence like Wayne's was a different matter entirely. He had a habit of holding eye contact just a bit longer than expected, as if silently challenging you not to look away first. Dickinson became hyper-aware of every movement, every breath, every inflection. She knew even the tiniest slip could ruin the rhythm Hawks wanted. Still, she rose to the challenge. In that first scene, she delivered her lines with crisp confidence, playing Feathers as sharp and self-assured. Hawks nodded with quiet approval. Wayne, however, offered nothing more than a brief nod of his own, a small gesture. But to Dickinson, it felt like she'd just passed her first test. And in a way, it felt like she'd stepped into an unspoken game she'd have to keep winning. A few days into filming, she started noticing something else: Wayne's subtle adjustments. Sometimes he stepped just slightly closer, forcing the camera to reframe around him. Sometimes he let his pauses stretch a little too long, drawing the viewer's attention back his way. It wasn't sabotage, but it was control. He knew how to command the frame, instinctively or intentionally. And Dickinson quickly realized that sharing a scene with him meant constantly negotiating for space. That negotiation reached its breaking point during a scene that appeared deceptively simple: just two characters talking in a dim, quiet room. Nothing explosive. No gunshots. No fights. But in that simplicity was the most intense power struggle she would face during the entire shoot. The script called for a quiet exchange, just Feathers and Sheriff Chance talking. Hawks understood that the most revealing moments in Rio Bravo didn't come from the action sequences, but from the silences between words. Dickinson expected the scene to build the characters' connection. Instead, it turned into a battle of endurance. Wayne entered slowly, his boots sounding heavier than usual. He leaned against the doorframe, taking up so much space that even his shadow seemed to dominate the set. Hawks called action. Dickinson delivered her opening lines with a spark meant to pull him in, but Wayne didn't respond. He let the silence stretch far beyond what was written. The pause wasn't huge. It wasn't something a casual viewer would even notice. But to Dickinson, standing in the moment, it felt like slamming into an invisible wall. She had seconds to choose: follow his slowed rhythm, or push forward on her own. She chose to push forward. She met his stare and delivered her next line with just a hint more edge, shifting feathers from playful to defiant. That single choice changed the entire energy of the scene. Wayne responded, but his drawl thickened. His body language loosened, not surrendering control, but adjusting, recalibrating. Suddenly, it wasn't just acting. It was two people testing each other, live under the lights. Hawks kept the cameras rolling. He could sense the electricity in the air, and the version that made it into the film still carries that underlying tension, though. Audiences never knew the quiet duel beneath the dialogue. When the director finally called cut, Wayne looked at Dickinson with a half smile. Not approval, not dismissal, something in between. A look that said, "You held your ground this time, and that this time hung in the air." Dickinson understood then that every scene with Wayne would be its own negotiation, its own subtle competition. That realization turned out to be essential, because the real challenges were just beginning. Not from dialogue, but from the physical demands of the production. If the verbal scenes were mental sparring matches, the action sequences were something entirely different. Dickinson had worked on tough sets before, but nothing matched a Howard Hawks Western in the late 1950s. There were no shortcuts, no easy stand-ins. Horses were real. Guns were heavy. The heat was relentless. The dust hung in the air even after the cameras stopped rolling. One of the most grueling scenes for her was a ride into town where Feathers had to move with the kind of confidence that matched any seasoned cowboy on screen. Dickinson's experience with horses was limited, and Rio Bravo didn't exactly offer her time to ease into it. The production expected her to ride smoothly, naturally, confidently. Wayne, on the other hand, had spent a lifetime in the saddle. He moved with the relaxed assurance of someone who didn't need to think about balance or posture. That effortless command of the horse and of the space around him made Dickinson's nerves feel even sharper. During their first rehearsal, Wayne offered quick pointers in his deep, steady voice. "Sit straight. Don't look like you're hanging on for dear life." He wasn't trying to be harsh. He was simply telling her what needed to be done. But with the crew watching and the desert heat pressing down, the comments landed with extra weight. This wasn't just about nailing a scene. It was about proving she belonged in the frame beside him. On one take, her horse jerked unexpectedly. Dickinson kept her balance, tightening her grip without breaking character. Wayne noticed instantly. Without disrupting his own performance, he shifted his horse just enough to block the camera's view of her misstep. It was small, subtle in action that could be read two different ways. Maybe he was protecting her, or maybe he was reminding her and everyone watching that he was still the one steering the moment. These kinds of moments accumulated over the shoot. Sometimes Wayne's dominance felt like mentorship, pushing her to grow more confident. Other times it felt like a quiet assertion of hierarchy. It's the unspoken truth that no matter how strong her performance was, the Western world they were building still revolved around him. Hawks didn't interfere. If anything, he enjoyed the natural tension. Knowing it made the chemistry between Feathers and Chance more electric on screen, by the final weeks of filming, Dickinson had learned how to balance collaboration with competition. She understood Wayne's rhythms, his instincts, and the quiet signals that revealed when he was offering support versus when he was claiming space. But the most revealing moment didn't happen in front of the cameras. It happened off to the side, in a fading sliver of daylight. During a small break, the crew barely noticed. The shoot had run long. The crew scrambled to reset equipment before they lost the last bit of sun. Dickinson, exhausted but focused, had just completed a demanding scene, both physical and emotional. As the crew reset the lights, Wayne didn't return to his chair. He stayed where he was, hat in hand, watching her with that same steady, unreadable stillness he carried everywhere. When he finally stepped toward her, his voice was low and even, like always. But this time, the words weren't about her delivery or her timing. They were about her presence. "You've got to own the space," he told her. "Don't let anyone crowd you out. Not even me." At first, it sounded like encouragement, but Dickinson felt the layers beneath it. This wasn't just advice. It was an acknowledgement of the power dynamics they had been navigating since day one. In a John Wayne film, the frame itself was almost built around him. Yes, she could be strong. Yes, she could stand tall. But she needed to understand the reality. The audience's eyes would always, instinctively, drift back to him. It was a message wrapped in respect and warning. Own your space, but never forget whose world you're stepping into. It was one of the few times Wayne let a bit of honesty slip through the armor he always carried. But even then, it was wrapped in that familiar, commanding tone. He wasn't offering equality. What he was offering was recognition and acknowledgement that she'd earned her place beside him. And right behind that acknowledgement was the reminder that his place, status, his dominance, was never up for debate. There was no bragging in it, no malice. It was simply how he believed Hollywood worked, how it should work. In his mind, he was the fixed point around which everything else moved. Dickinson didn't resent him for it. She understood it. Years later, she would look back on that moment as the clearest window into who John Wayne really was when the cameras weren't rolling. He wasn't trying to diminish her or make her feel small. In fact, there was admiration, their real respect for her ability to stand strong, scene after scene. But he also carried an absolute certainty that he was the center of every room he walked into. That certainty shaped everything: his acting style, his interactions, the entire energy on set. It was the same force that drew audiences to him for decades, and the same force that made his co-stars fight just a little harder to hold their ground. For Dickinson, that quiet exchange answered a question she'd been wrestling with since her first day on set. Could she really stand as an equal to a man like John Wayne? Her answer was yes, but only if she met his unshakable confidence with her own. Not louder, not bigger, just unwavering. Even when the frame, the story, the legend itself seemed built for him, Angie Dickinson's experience on Rio Bravo wasn't just another acting job. It became a masterclass in presence, power, and survival in Hollywood's golden age. Wayne was every bit as commanding as the myth suggested, and working beside him forced her to hold her ground without losing her voice. Decades later, reflections carried both admiration and unease. But they also carried gratitude. Because for all his dominance, John Wayne unintentionally taught her the lesson that shaped the rest of her career.